"Please, mister, we're not stealing, we're just hungry." Those trembling words shattered the rhythm of New York's rain that night. Alexander Bennett, a man whose signature could shift millions, froze at the sight of three little girls huddled beneath a flickering street lamp. Their faces were pale, their clothes soaked, and their eyes, those wide, desperate eyes, reflected something he hadn't seen in years: innocence on the edge of ruin. That moment in the downpour outside his empire's glass tower would unmake the businessman and awaken the man beneath. Because sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truth. "Mister, please, we're hungry." The voice was small, trembling and nearly lost in the roar of the November rain. Alexander Bennett froze one hand on the door of his black Bentley as the words reached him. Across the street, under the flickering neon sign of a closed bookstore, three little girls huddled together. Their soaked coats clung to them like second skin, their faces pale beneath tangled hair, and yet their eyes, wide, pleading, unflinchingly brave, held something that made even the coldest night seem to pause. He could have pretended not to hear. Most people did. The city was full of cries that vanished into the storm before they could touch a conscience. But something about these three, something in the way the smallest one shielded the other two, with her arms cut through years of walls Alexander had built around himself. He crossed the street before his mind had time to argue. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. The oldest girl straightened instinctively, placing herself in front of her sisters. We were just trying to get money for food," she stammered. "We didn't mean to bother anyone." Her name, he would later learn, was Nora, and that quiet defiance would be the first thing about her that reminded him of himself. Alexander looked around. Cars hissed through puddles, headlights carving ghosts across the wet pavement. It was nearly midnight, and Manhattan had turned into a maze of reflections, light bouncing off glass and water, off loneliness and success. He'd spent years mastering both. He was the man who built empires, who commanded boardrooms with a glance. And yet here he stood, drenched, speechless, before three starving children. "Where are your parents?" he finally asked. The middle girl, Emma, lifted her gaze slowly. "Mama's gone," she whispered. "And Ray says, we can't come home until we bring money." The smallest, Lucy, clung to Emma's sleeve, shivering violently. Alexander swallowed hard. He'd seen exploitation before in contracts and negotiations, but never this raw. He glanced back at his car where his driver waited, confusion on his face. "Get the heater running," Alexander called, surprising himself. "They're coming with us." The girls exchanged uncertain glances. "We're not supposed to go with strangers," Nora murmured. "Good," Alexander replied quietly. "That means you're smart. But tonight you're coming someplace safe." Minutes later, they sat inside the Bentley, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Rain streaked down the tinted windows as the city blurred past neon glass and the endless pulse of power that Alexander had long mistaken for life. Lucy pressed her small hand against the glass, whispering, "It looks like stars melting." Alexander blinked, startled by the poetry of it. He hadn't looked at the city that way in years. At a corner diner glowing against the storm, he stopped. The waitress raised an eyebrow as he entered, a man in a designer suit, carrying three drenched little girls, but said nothing as he guided them to a booth. "Order anything," he told them, sliding the laminated menu forward. They hesitated until Emma, cautious but curious, asked, "Anything?" "Anything," he repeated. When the food arrived, the sound of rain outside faded into nothing. The girls devoured burgers and fries like they'd been starving for days, which, as he would later discover, they had. He watched them eat, feeling something strange tighten in his chest, something that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with memory. He had once been a small boy, too, sitting in a diner with his twin brother Michael, sharing one plate because that was all they could afford. It was a lifetime ago, but for a flickering second it came rushing back, the warmth of family, the promise that someone cared enough to stay. "Do you have a home?" Lucy asked, suddenly, her voice soft but curious. Alexander almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Yes," he said, "a very big one." "Then why do you look so sad?" she asked, blinking up at him with guileless honesty. The question hit harder than any accusation. He had everything money could buy, penthouse views, private jets power, but not one person who asked if he was sad. Until tonight. When the rain finally eased, he drove them uptown to his penthouse, a fortress of glass and marble that had never once felt like a home. As the elevator doors slid open, Lucy gasped. "It's like a castle," she whispered. "Can we stay here till the rain stops?" "Just until morning," Alexander said automatically, though his heart already knew that was a lie. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson, his longtime housekeeper, nearly dropped her coffee tray when she found 3 little girls eating cereal at the kitchen island, while impeccable Alexander Bennett stood barefoot in his robe, flipping pancakes. He tried to explain, but Mrs. Patterson simply looked at him with quiet understanding. Sometimes, she said, the people who least expect to be needed end up being the ones needed most. As he watched Nora help Emma reach the syrup and Lucy giggle when the pancake flipped too high, Alexander realized that something irreversible had happened in the night. The empire he had spent decades building suddenly felt small compared to the fragile warmth blooming in his kitchen. He didn't know it yet, but that rainy night, the night 3 little sisters looked at him with hope instead of fear, would change everything. Not his company, not his wealth, but him. Forever. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Manhattan washed in pale winter light that spilled across the marble floors of Alexander Bennett's penthouse. The city below was already roaring back to life, horns and footsteps echoing up from Fifth Avenue, but inside the towering glass walls of the Bennett residence there was an unfamiliar sound: laughter. Small, hesitant, fragile at first, then bright as sunlight breaking through cloud. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen near the kitchen island, her usual composure faltering. 3 little girls sat perched on the high stools, oversized T-shirts swallowing their thin frames, giggling as they watched Alexander, impeccable, untouchable. Alexander attempt to pour pancake batter without setting off the smoke alarm. "Mr. Bennett," she said finally, "I wasn't aware we were expecting guests." Alexander, hair slightly disheveled, sleeves rolled up, looked more human than she had seen him in years. "Neither was I," he replied dryly. It was a situation." Nora, the oldest, gave a shy smile. "He saved us," she said quietly, glancing up at him with a mix of gratitude and caution. "Only for the night," Alexander corrected, though the words didn't sit right in his mouth. "Until I figure things out." Mrs. Patterson studied the 3 children, Nora's protective arm around Emma's soft focus, as she stacked syrup bottles by height, Lucy's messy curls and syrup-sticky fingers. Years of managing elite households had taught her to read what money couldn't hide. These girls weren't strays or troublemakers. They were survivors. After breakfast, Alexander retreated to his office, the soundproofed sanctuary where he usually made decisions worth millions. But today, his focus refused to stay on market charts or corporate emails. Instead, he found himself glancing toward the security monitor showing the kitchen feed. Lucy was drawing on a napkin. Emma was washing dishes beside Mrs. Patterson, and Nora was quietly folding the blankets they'd slept under on the couch. Something inside him twisted. They didn't act like guests. They acted like children desperate not to be a burden. When he returned, Nora looked up anxiously. "We can go now," she said, her small voice rehearsed in apology. "Ray will be mad if we're late." The name brought back the conversation from the night before, the way her eyes had darkened when she said it. Ray Alexander repeated slowly. "Where does he live, Emma?" Hesitated, then whispered, "The place with the broken stairs." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "West 43rd and 10th Avenue. That's no place for children." Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure when this stopped being an accident and became a responsibility, but the idea of sending them back there felt like cruelty, disguised as logic. "You'll stay here for now," he said firmly. Lucy blinked. "But you said, 'I know what I said.'" He interrupted. "Plans change." That afternoon, while the girls explored under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye, Alexander called James, his head of security. "Find everything you can about a man named Ray Dodson, West 43rd and 10th Avenue. Quietly." James didn't ask questions, he never did. But Alexander could hear the curiosity in his voice. "Understood, sir." Hours later, the report arrived, 3 prior convictions for fraud probation violations, neighbors reporting neglect and possible abuse. The man had no legal claim over the children, no family, no paperwork, beyond a falsified guardianship from a deceased girlfriend. Alexander closed the file, the weight of decision already pressing on him. He walked back into the living room, where the girls were sprawled on the floor watching a cartoon they'd never seen before. Lucy had fallen asleep against his couch. Emma was sharing popcorn with Nora, who kept glancing toward him as though expecting him to change his mind. "You're safe here," he said finally. "No one is taking you back." Emma's eyes widened. "For real? For now," he repeated softly. That night, while the city glittered beneath his penthouse windows, Alexander found himself unable to sleep. He stood by the glass wall watching headlights snake across the bridge, the hum of success that used to comfort him now strangely hollow. His phone buzzed a message from Victoria Caldwell, his former partner turned rival. "Tomorrow's board meeting is critical. Don't be late again. The investors are nervous." He typed, "I'll be there," and set the phone aside. But when he turned, he saw Lucy standing in the doorway in one of his oversized T-shirts, clutching a stuffed bear Mrs. Patterson had found in storage. "I had a bad dream," she whispered. He hesitated only a second before kneeling. "About what, Ray? He says he's coming." Alexander exhaled slowly. "He's not, I promise." The word promise felt dangerous, fragile. But when Lucy climbed into his lap and leaned against him, he didn't move. For the first time in years, he stayed perfectly still and simply listened to her breathing, to the quiet hum of a city that finally felt like more than numbers. The next morning, chaos returned. Mrs. Patterson shooed the girls into the spare room, straightening the breakfast table just as the elevator chimed. "Miss Caldwell, to see you, sir," the doorman's voice announced. Victoria swept in like she owned the air around her. Perfect hair, perfect heels, perfect disdain. "Alexander," she said crisply, "you missed 3 calls last night. Are we running a company or an orphanage now?" Her gaze landed on a pink sweater draped over a chair. "Whose is that?" Before Alexander could respond, Lucy appeared, peeking out from behind the hallway door. Victoria's eyes widened. "You're babysitting Alexander," forced a smile. "Something like that." "This is madness," she said. "You're handing me your legacy on a silver platter. The board won't tolerate distractions." He met her stare evenly. "Distraction or not, they're staying until I say otherwise." Her lips curled. "You've gone soft." Maybe he said, or maybe I've finally remembered what matters. As the door shut behind her, silence filled the marble halls again. Only this time, it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. The laughter from the guest room returned small and sincere. In that moment, Alexander Bennett, who once measured his worth by profit margins, understood something quietly devastating. His penthouse wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage. And those three little girls with their laughter echoing through the cold house of marble were the first to make it feel alive. The following week unfolded like a fragile dream. Alexander Bennett couldn't quite believe he was living. His immaculate penthouse, once a monument to isolation, now hummed with the rhythm of small footsteps and soft voices. Every polished surface had a fingerprint. Every silent corridor carried laughter. And though his empire wavered under corporate threats for the first time, his life felt undeniably full. But reality has always found its way back. It began with a phone call from his security chief, James. "We've located Ray Dodson," he said. "He's been asking around loudly, threatening to go to the police, claiming you kidnapped his daughters." Alexander's voice hardened. He's not their father. Legally, he might appear to be James Warned. He's waving around some guardianship papers, fake or not. If he plays this right, it could become a problem. A problem. That word had built Alexander's life. Problems to be solved, contracts to be conquered, risks to be controlled. But this three vulnerable children under his care, a predator ready to exploit them, this wasn't business. This was personal. That night, as Nora helped Mrs. Patterson fold laundry, and Emma tried to teach Lucy a clumsy waltz on the marble floor, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the framed photo of his late brother Michael, his twin, his other half, the one who'd chosen a different life, far from boardrooms and skyscrapers, only to vanish in a mountaineering accident 8 years earlier. For years, Alexander had tried not to think about him. Success had made forgetting easier. Until now. Because sometimes when Lucy laughed or Emma tilted her head in thought, he saw Michael, not just in their faces, but in their defiance, their quiet courage. The next morning, Sophia Morgan, his attorney, arrived with a folder. "We can file for temporary guardianship," she said. "It'll buy you time to protect them legally, but you'll need to prove Dodson's unfit." "That shouldn't be difficult," Alexander replied. "He's a criminal." "True," she said carefully. "But you're not exactly a picture of stability either. You're a billionaire bachelor with no experience raising children. Social services will scrutinize every detail." Alexander exhaled the weight of truth, settling like stone. "Then we'll give them details worth seeing." By evening, the penthouse had become a flurry of transformation. Mrs. Patterson supervised the assembly of 3 small beds in the guest suite. Nora labeled drawers. Emma arranged picture books. Lucy drew a crooked sign that read, "Our Room." For the first time, it wasn't his house, it was theirs. But their fragile peace shattered 3 days later. Ray Dodson showed up. He arrived unannounced, pounding on the lobby doors until security restrained him. His voice echoed through the marble atrium. "You can't keep them. They're mine," from the balcony. Alexander watched the chaos below. His blood ran cold, not from fear, but fury. "Call the police," he ordered. "File a trespassing report, and make sure he understands what happens if he ever comes near them again." But as Ray was escorted out, something in his smug grin sent a chill crawling up Alexander's spine. This wasn't over. Later that night, after he tucked the girls in, Alexander sat alone at his desk. The storm outside mirrored the one inside his chest. His empire was slipping through his fingers. Victoria Caldwell had called an emergency vote to strip him of authority, citing erratic behavior and personal entanglements. And now a criminal held fake papers that could tear away the only thing that mattered anymore. He opened the drawer, pulling out the one photograph he had left of Michael, both of them, 19 years old, laughing in front of a cabin in Vermont. His brother's arm slung around him, wild and free. A memory flickered. Michael's last words before the accident. "Don't lose yourself in the towers, Alex. Money doesn't keep you warm at night." At the time, Alexander had dismissed it as poetic nonsense. Now it felt like prophecy. The next morning, as he prepared for his board meeting, Lucy stumbled into the office, rubbing her eyes. "Are you leaving again?" "Just for a few hours," he said gently. "You always say that," Emma murmured from the doorway. Her words pierced him. For the first time in his career, Alexander arrived at a meeting without a briefcase, without notes, only a conviction burning in his chest. The boardroom buzzed with tension. Victoria stood at the far end, polished and triumphant. "We've all seen the reports," she said smoothly. "Photos of you escorting children into your penthouse missing investor meetings, avoiding press inquiries. The shareholders deserve better leadership." Alexander met her gaze. "I didn't realize compassion was a liability." "This isn't about compassion," she snapped. "It's about control. You've lost yours." She motioned toward the door. "Security will escort you out after the vote." He didn't stay to hear it. Instead, he walked out the city unfolding beneath him through the glass walls. Power had once meant everything. But as his phone buzzed with messages, lawyers, journalists, shareholders, he ignored them all and called Mrs. Patterson instead. "How are the girls?" "Fine," she said, then hesitated. "Actually, they found something in an old box of their mother's. Letters. I'll be home in 20 minutes. When he arrived, the girls sat cross-legged on the living room rug. Emma held a stack of envelopes bound by a faded ribbon. Lucy pointed to a photo, 3 infants cradled in the arms of a young woman whose smile felt hauntingly familiar. "She wrote these to someone named Michael Nora," said softly. "Do you know him?" The air drained from Alexander's lungs. He sank to his knees, trembling as he took the letter. His name, written in his brother's handwriting, was scrawled in the corner. The letter began simply, "Dearest Michael, the girls are growing fast. They have your eyes, your stubbornness. I wish you could see them." The room tilted. His pulse roared in his ears. "Their father was Michael," he whispered. Mrs. Patterson's hand covered her mouth. "Oh my God," Nora frowned. "You knew our dad." Alexander looked at their faces, 3 small mirrors of his brother. The truth pressed against his ribs until it became impossible to hold back. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "He was my brother, my twin." The girls stared, trying to process. "So, are you like our uncle?" Emma asked. Something in the word uncle softened the ache in his chest. "Something like that." When the girls went to bed that night, Alexander returned to his office and spread the letters across the desk. Each one was a thread, his brother's life, his choices, his hidden family. The realization struck with staggering clarity he hadn't just rescued strangers from the rain. He had brought his brother's children home. Outside, the city lights flickered like distant stars reflected on glass. Alexander reached for the phone, his decision already made. "James," he said, "I need to speak with Sophia in the morning. We're filing for permanent guardianship, and this time it won't be temporary." As he hung up, he glanced toward the hallway where soft laughter still drifted from the girls' room. For the first time since Michael's death, he didn't feel alone. The ghosts of the past had reopened their eyes, and in their gaze Alexander Bennett found not guilt but redemption. The morning after the revelation hung over the Bennett penthouse like mist after a storm. For Alexander, sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Michael's handwriting, the letters, the truth, the years lost between them. The girls were his brother's children, his blood, his responsibility. And now that truth, both blessing and burden, demanded a price. The first blow came swiftly. Victoria Caldwell's maneuver to remove him as CEO passed in a unanimous vote. By the time Alexander arrived at Bennett Enterprises, his nameplate had already been removed. The same executives who once applauded his precision now avoided his gaze. In a single stroke, decades of empire building crumbled not because of failure, but because he dared to care. When he stepped into his office to gather the few personal things he'd kept, an antique watch, a model plane, a framed photo of him and Michael, he found Sophia Morgan waiting. "I warned you," she said softly. "The board wanted stability, and you gave them humanity. They don't know what to do with that." He gave a small, tired smile. Maybe they never did. That night, Alexander returned home to find the penthouse lights dimmed. The girls were asleep, tangled together under one blanket, their faces peaceful in a way that broke him. Mrs. Patterson approached quietly. "They waited for you," she said. "Lucy wouldn't eat until she knew you were coming back." He exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure what I'm coming back to anymore." She gave him a long, steady look. "You already know. You just don't want to believe it yet." The following days became a blur of hearings, legal filings, and whispered threats. Ray Dodson resurfaced with a lawyer, claiming Alexander had manipulated the system to steal his family. The tabloids devoured it, Billionaire's secret family, the hidden heir scandal. The same public that once admired him now tore him apart. Through it all, the girls never wavered. Nora comforted Emma when nightmares came. Lucy drew pictures of Uncle Alex flying kites with them in the park. Their quiet faith steadied him when everything else fell away. One night, Sophia arrived with an envelope. "The judge scheduled an emergency hearing," she said. "Dodson's demanding custody. It's tomorrow." Alexander felt his stomach twist. "And our chances without proof of blood relation slim," she admitted. "Unless—" He frowned. "Unless what?" "Unless you take the test." It was a simple choice on paper. A DNA test could confirm he was their biological uncle, but the process required medical authorization, privacy waivers, and exposure every detail of Michael's hidden life, their mother's identity, and the children's origins laid bare in public record. It meant destroying what little privacy they had left. That night, Alexander stood by the window, the city glowing beneath him like veins of light. Mrs. Patterson joined him quietly. "You can't protect them and hide them at the same time," she said. "You have to choose." He looked at the reflection of himself, a man stripped of titles of armor, but still standing. "If I lose everything," he murmured, "I just want them safe." At dawn, he made his choice. The courtroom was cold. Spring returned to Maplewood, New Jersey, quietly, lined with journalists and cameras. Dodson smirked from across the aisle, his lawyers spouting lies about family loyalty. The girls sat near Sophia, clutching each other's hands. When it was Alexander's turn to speak, he didn't look at the cameras. He looked at them. "These children are not property," he said. "They are not assets to be traded or names to exploit. They are my brother's daughters. They are my family. I failed to protect him when he was alive. I will not fail them now." A hush fell over the room. Dodson's lawyer objected, demanding proof. That was when Sophia handed the judge a sealed envelope, the DNA results. Positive. Unmistakable. The truth was in the blood. Dodson's composure cracked. He shouted, cursed, lunged forward before officers restrained him. As he was dragged away, Lucy began to cry. Alexander crossed the room, knelt beside her, and whispered, "It's over. You're safe." The ruling came hours later, full guardianship granted to Alexander Bennett. The girls were officially his family, but victory carried a price. By the end of the week, Alexander's business empire had dissolved, investors fleeing headlines branding him a fallen tycoon. His assets were frozen, pending investigation. Yet, when he returned home that night, Nora met him at the door with a drawing 4 stick figures under a blue sky labeled Us. He smiled for the first time in weeks. "What's this our family?" she said simply. "We don't need money for that." And in that moment, Alexander understood. Love wasn't a transaction or an empire to defend. It was a choice to stay when every reason told you to walk away. That winter, he sold the penthouse. The house of marble was too large, too cold, too full of ghosts. With the proceeds, he bought a quiet old home on the edge of Maplewood, a place with chipped paint, wide windows, and a backyard big enough for laughter. On moving day, Lucy ran through the empty hall shouting, "It echoes." Emma followed, twirling in the light that spilled across the worn floorboards. Nora looked up at him, hesitant. "Do you think he'd be proud Alexander didn't need to ask who she meant?" "I think he already is," he said softly. And as he watched them chase one another across the faded sunlight, he realized that losing everything had given him what he never knew. He needed a reason to live for something beyond himself. The price of love, he thought, wasn't loss. It was courage. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to pay it. Spring returned to Maplewood quietly, as if the earth itself was holding its breath before exhaling new life. The snow had melted into the river, and where the ice once choked the current, now the water flowed clear and endless. The Bennett home, no longer a penthouse of glass and marble, but a weathered two-story house by the river, stood modest yet warm, its windows lit with laughter. For Alexander, every morning began the same way. He'd sit by the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, watching sunlight spill across the water as the girls raced down the back porch in mismatched boots. Emma always led Daring the Wind. Lucy trailed behind gathering wildflowers, and Nora, responsible as ever, carried a blanket for their picnic by the shore. It had been 6 months since the court granted full guardianship. The world had stopped calling him CEO or billionaire. Now he was simply Dad. The title still felt fragile on his tongue, but it was the only one that mattered. The transition hadn't been easy. There were nights when the lights flickered because the power bill came late mornings when he burned breakfast, evenings when exhaustion pressed against his bones. But then Emma would climb onto his lap with a book, or Lucy would slip her small hand into his, or Nora would whisper, "You're doing great, Uncle Alex." And suddenly, every sacrifice felt small. One afternoon, he took the girls into town to the local library. It was an old red brick building overlooking the river bend, filled with the smell of paper and dust. Mrs. Patterson had arranged part-time work there to keep her busy, though everyone knew she simply couldn't stop taking care of them. As they browsed the aisles, the librarian, a kind woman with silver hair, asked for his name to make new library cards. "Alexander Bennett," he replied out of habit. Nora hesitated, then said softly, "Can ours say Bennett, too?" For a moment the world tilted. He knelt to meet their eyes, voice low, but steady. "Someday soon," he said. "When it's all official." Lucy grinned. "We can all match." Later that evening, after the girls were asleep, Alexander found himself by the river, the moon, reflecting on the moving water like shards of glass. He thought of Michael, the brother, whose shadow still lingered in every laugh, every stubborn tilt of Emma's chin. "You left them in my care," he murmured. "I hope I'm doing it right." Mrs. Patterson joined him, wrapping her shawl tighter. "He'd be proud," she said. "You've turned this house into a home." The next morning brought unexpected news. Sophia called with an offer. A foundation wanted Alexander to speak at a youth conference on rebuilding after loss. "They want your story," she said. "Not the business version, the real one." He almost declined. But later that week he stood before a small audience in a community center in Manhattan. Gone was the tailored suit and executive tone. He spoke instead about second chances, how sometimes life tears down everything you build just to show you what was worth keeping. He talked about the 3 girls who taught him that love isn't charity, It's commitment, that success isn't wealth, it's peace. When he finished, the applause was soft but real. A woman in the front row, an exhausted mother by the look in her eyes, approached afterward. "Your story, it gives people like me hope," she said. He smiled faintly. It gave me hope, too. Back in Maplewood, the girls were waiting by the porch. Emma ran to him first. "Did they like your speech?" "I think they did," he said, scooping her up. "But I like this greeting more." That weekend they planted a small garden by the riverbank. The girls chose flowers, lavender daisies, and white lilies. For Mom and Dad, Nora whispered. Together they placed a stone at the edge of the garden, engraved simply with "Love builds everything." As dusk settled, they sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a shared blanket. Fireflies blinked above the grass, and the river sang its quiet song beneath the stars. Lucy leaned against him, half asleep. "Do you think it'll always be this way?" she murmured. Alexander looked at the horizon, where sky met water, where endings and beginnings always blurred. "Maybe not always," he said gently. "But as long as we keep choosing each other, it'll be enough." He glanced toward the living room window. Inside, the light glowed softly against the walls, warm, steady, alive. It wasn't the light of chandeliers or skyscrapers. It was something purer, the glow of belonging. And as the river carried the reflection of their little house out into the night, Alexander Bennett finally understood that home wasn't built from marble or glass, but for moments like this, small, imperfect, miraculous. A home by the river where grief had once drowned, now overflowed with love. When the story of Alexander Bennett began, it was a tale of power, isolation, and control. A man at the top of the world surrounded by glass walls and marble floors who believed that success meant distance, that emotions were liabilities, and that people were replaceable. But fate had a way of rewriting his definition of value. One cold November night, when 3 frightened girls appeared on his doorstep, the empire he had built began to shift from stone to heart. Those girls, Nora, Emma, and Lucy, entered his life like a quiet storm. They didn't ask for wealth or power. They asked for safety, for warmth, for someone who wouldn't walk away. In their presence, Alexander discovered that the walls he'd built to keep pain out had also kept love from ever coming in. Every decision that followed, defying corrupt business partners standing in court to protect them, and ultimately losing the fortune that once defined him, was a step toward rediscovering his humanity. Through every trial, from the boardroom betrayals to the long nights of doubt, the truth came into focus. Those girls weren't strangers he had rescued. They were family, the daughters of his late brother Michael. That revelation changed everything. It wasn't fate's cruelty, it was grace in disguise. The universe had given him one last chance to protect the part of his brother that still lived on. When Alexander lost his company, it wasn't failure, it was freedom. He learned that the truest form of leadership wasn't commanding thousands of employees, but guiding 3 small hearts through the world with patience and courage. His new life by the river was not lesser than the empire he'd once owned. It was richer, fuller, and infinitely more alive. Every morning, laughter filled the house. Every evening ended with stories by the fire. The mansion of marble had turned into a humble home, but it was a home built on love, not ambition. The final chapter wasn't about victory, it was about peace. Alexander discovered that healing doesn't happen when life becomes perfect. It happens when we stop running from our pain and start building something new with it. The ghosts of his past didn't vanish. They learned to live beside him, whispering reminders of where he came from and why he could never go back. And as the river flowed outside his window, he understood love had always been there waiting. He'd just been too proud to listen. The lesson from Alexander's story reaches far beyond his fictional world. It speaks to every one of us who's ever lost our way chasing the wrong kind of success. We live in a time when wealth is mistaken for worth, when productivity replaces peace, and when people forget that no amount of power can fill the quiet ache of loneliness. Alexander's journey teaches us that redemption begins not when we acquire more, but when we start giving more, our time, our care, our willingness to stay even when it's hard. His story reminds us that family isn't just blood, it's anyone who chooses to love us through the storm. It tells us that even when everything falls apart, we can rebuild not from what we've lost, but from what we've learned. And most importantly, it reminds us that love always costs something, but it's the only price worth paying. So, as you reflect on Alexander Bennett's story, ask yourself, what truly makes your life full? What would you fight for if everything else was stripped away? Sometimes, the greatest success is simply being the person who shows up when others turn away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion still matters in a world that often forgets, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and help us keep creating heartfelt tales that touch the soul. Because somewhere out there, someone needs a reminder that love, even after loss, can build something beautiful again.